to chapter 23. The lesson will really start in 24, but we never finished last time, and so I'm just going to, instead of jumping and skipping, we'll jump in where we left off. And so chapter 23, verses 1 through 5. Have someone like to read those 5 verses for us to begin? So 23, 1 through 5. Okay, Gary? Okay, good. We'll just stop right there. So let me, we'll see if this works. The what now? Oh, I see. It's not on the screen. There we go. Okay. So everything seems to be a little squashed. So there are some pictures of some landscape. It'll just keep in mind it's a little squashed for this. So we're going to finish up the previous lesson. Remember, decisions in desperation. So David is a fugitive. He's running for his life from King Saul. So in the desperation of the situation, he makes some what I would call not the wisest choices. So I call them unwise choices, but God remained faithful to David because David, through all of that, kept his eyes on the Lord. And that's really a key issue for us as well. And through all those circumstances, David was being humbled by God. He was learning to depend upon the Lord, who is always faithful and trustworthy. And that's really what we need to see. God did the same thing with Moses. God did the same thing with Paul. Same thing with Peter. And on it goes, that every useful servant of God is humbled by their circumstances and situation. So that's where we're at with that. So at one point, David was hiding out in the cave of Adullam. He is joined by his family and relatives and by about 400 men at that time. Now later on, Abiathar, the priest, joins him as he flees from the destruction of his hometown of Nob. King Saul had Doeg, the Edomite, execute his father. This is Abiathar's father, Ahimelech, along with 84 other priests, having falsely charged them with conspiracy with David against the king. Now, David wasn't not against King Saul, but that was the conspiracy, that was the accusation. It reveals to us that when someone is really angry and suspicious and even bitter, more suspicious than bitter. Bitterness would probably fit in there as well. But you can go to extents you never thought you would. Just things you do, things you say, things you want done. He goes so far as to kill priests. So that's just how far it went. So we didn't quite finish this. So David hears about the Philistine attack on the nearby city where they're hiding out. And so it's real close to there, Keilah. It was interesting. I was saying, how do I pronounce that exactly? And so my Bible's, it is Keilah. There's a 2 syllables in those two Keilah. But I listened to one and it was Kyla. Another one said Keilah. And I thought, well, that doesn't help at all. So it's really defined here the way it's civilized in the Bible. So what did David do? We already read it, but what did David do? at this time when he was wondering. So the Philistines attacked this city, and the thing they were what does it say, the threshing floors, that would be not just the place they threshed the grain, but also the place where the storage was. So that means the Philistines were not just attacking the city, but they were robbing the goods that were stored for the wintertime. And so this was more than just hurting the people, this was hurting the people long term. So what did David do? Yes? Yeah, he asked counsel from the Lord. And then his men said, whoa, boy, David, I don't know if we should go, because God says, no, go to Keilah, go ahead and save the city. And his men said, whoa, boy, we're already fleeing from Judah, and now you want us to go fight the Philistines. And we don't think that's a good idea, David. So then what did David do? Yeah, he asked again. And then, his men were afraid. And so then they finally, after the Lord said it the second time, they went and defeated the Philistines there at Keilah, saved the city. And so that's just a reminder that David, even in this desperate situation, he was always seeking counsel from the Lord. And let me go on here for the sake of time. So just so you know so Adullam is over this way. This is where he was at previously, so I'm not sure where the cave is at. But anyway, he defeats the Philistines there at Keilah. And then Saul hears that David is in Keilah, and he thinks, David has put himself into a city. We'll come there, we'll surround that city, he'll never get away, and so we'll attack him. And so it's really interesting to me, again, the thinking of King Saul. Look at verse number 8. Someone read verse 8, just to see how many people he got together to go attack David. Yes, Don? Okay, so we're talking probably a couple 100,000 if he called everybody, and it does say that he called all the people, and so I don't know if maybe he called just some people in the local area, but nonetheless, it was probably thousands and thousands of people. So what does David do in verses 10 through 12? And just we can read that again, or just read it to yourself. What does David do in this occasion? He's asking. Well, he's asking the Lord, what do you want me to do? Again, yeah. So he's seeking counsel from the Lord, and so he hears that Saul's coming, and so he says, "Hey, will the men of Keilah deliver me into Saul's hands?" And God says, "Yes, they will." and so then he continues on is Saul going to come down? He says yes. And so forth. And so David's seeking counsel of the Lord. So eventually what happens in verse 13, let's read that. I'll go ahead and read that one. Then David and his men, which were about 600. Now think about that. What's different than earlier? How many did he have with him earlier? Yeah, he had 400, and now he's got 600. So apparently some more people were coming and joining David's side in this. So he rose and departed out of Keilah and went whithersoever they could go. So apparently, maybe a couple times let's go. No, that's not a good way. Let's go this way. So wherever they could go, I don't know if they split up. It doesn't say that. I don't think so, because they're still together later on. And it was told Saul that David was escaped from Keilah, and he forbore to go forth. So when he stopped, Saul just said, okay, he's not there anymore. We'll just not go there now. So just a lesson here through prayer. And remember, he had the ephod. He said he got the ephod. And probably what that was, and it came with Abiathar, brought it with him. It says in verse 9. So that was most likely with the Urim and Thummim. And so that was the stones there that the priests had, and if there was a question, they could discern it, sort of like casting lots, sort of a divine lot. So that seems to be, but it was been involved in that. But just the prayer guided him to save the city, and later on the prayer guided him to flee the city. So God says, okay, no, go save the city. So they saved the city, and things went well. And then David says, oh, King Saul's after me. Are these men gonna give me over to the king? And God said yes. And so David fled the city, and so it was Both of those were by God's guidance. And so I think that's just a lesson for all of us about sometimes God directs us to move forward. Sometimes he directs us to pull back. And so that's why we always need God's direction on things, because we can't know those the way we should without him. And then from there, there's just a chase through the wilderness. And so we'll just look at this map here for a moment. So he was in Keilah. He goes next time. He flees down to the wilderness of Ziph. And so he's out there in the wilderness. And then Jonathan finds David, encourages him, and then he returns. But he goes all the way from Gibeah, where his dad is at, comes all the way down, finds David in the wilderness. And I do want to look at that. Notice before we look at that, notice verse 14 a moment. It sort of summarizes what follows, but it says, David abode in the wilderness in strongholds and remained in a mountain in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God delivered him not into his hand. So either it's saying, okay, here, and then he's going to discuss the different events, how that happened later on, or it maybe there was other short-term things, but his life was just filled with chaos. So just keep that in mind. King Saul is after him. And this is, again, how far he's gone with his suspicion and all that kind of stuff. It became his consuming focus. I got to get David. I got to get David. I got to get David. Oh, king, we got these things. I don't. We can put that off till tomorrow. I got to go get David. Well, king, you got a responsibility here. Okay, let me get that. And I got to go get David. And so he was shirking some of his responsibility as king. But notice when Jonathan came down. Let's read 16 through 18. Someone like to read these few verses for us. So still in chapter 23, 16 through 18. Someone read that for us. Okay, Don.
And Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David into the wood and strengthened his hand in God. And he said unto him, Fear not, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find thee. Thou shalt be king over Israel, and I shall be next unto thee. And that also Saul my father knoweth. And they two made a covenant before the Lord, and David abode in the wood, and Jonathan went to his house.
Okay, so, the traveling, I don't know how long it would take, but it's 40 to 60 miles. I can't remember exactly, but it's a good distance. And so he goes to find his friend. And as he finds his friend there, the summary statement is in verse 16, where he strengthened his hand in God. And so his friend helped him, got a better grip on the Lord. It wasn't just, hey, David, it's gonna be fine. Hey, things will be okay. No, he helped him so he could, and so it doesn't say exactly, but it apparently they probably prayed. Jonathan probably said some things, and we do have some dialogue here with that was part of the means of the things he said. But just that concept is, what your friend needs most of all when they're in a desperate situation? They need to, if they're saved, obviously that's the key issue, but they need to strengthen their grip in God. That's always an answer. It's always a situation that every one of us needs. And we all need encouragers. That's why I think it's interesting in... who was that in the early church in the first chapters of the book of Acts that were... he was known as a son of consolation or a son of encouragement. Who was that? Barnabas, yeah. And that's where they gave him a nickname. I forgot his given name, but Barnabas has aspect of son of consolation, son of encouragement, and so that's what he was, because everybody needs that, and so that's what we need to be in our lives for that. So let's look at a few things as he helped him, to be spiritually strong, get his focus on God, because everything was going wrong for David at this time. So what are some things you notice? That as you read verse 17 and 18, it doesn't matter. We can go out of order. But does something stick out to you that David or that Jonathan told David, just as a general principle that would help us all? Okay, his father will not find him. You're safe, David. And again, he's talking about the Lord's guidance and direction. I think finding him would be the same thing as killing him. And so you're going to be safe, David. And so that was a great encouragement. Anything else? Yeah, and so God is going to fulfill his promise. He anointed you. You're going to be king. That's how it is. And the next, I think it's the next phrase. No, the very last part of that. The next part is neat too. I like, I shall be next unto thee. What is he? When he says that, what is he telling David? What's Jonathan says? You'll become king. I'll be next to thee. What's the concept there, Chris? Yeah, his helper, his support. And what's really neat is, yes, Saul, my father, is king. I have the right to that throne, but I recognize God has sovereignly put you in that place. And so I'm going to be supportive. I'm going to be with you. I'm not going to be antagonistic. I'm not going to fight against you. I'm your support. And I'm there for you. And that's always a great encouragement. And then the last statement in verse 17, I think, is interesting as well. Saul, my father, knoweth. He knows that. It's not a mystery to my father. And yet, think about it, what King Saul is doing. He's chasing David out. I don't care what God said. I mean, that's almost where I'm going to take David out. And then God cannot fulfill his word. You know, when you start fighting against God, it's always a losing battle. You know, you think of Jonah, think of others. But sometimes we can do that in our own life. We know, you know, maybe an attitude that we have or something that we ought to do and we don't do, or something we don't want to, you know, whatever it happens to be. And we get stuck in that, you know, that God says, no, you can't fight and win. And it's not that he says, I'm going to win this battle. That's not the concept. He says, I love you and I want my blessing on you, but I can't shed my blessing the way I'd like to. I can't bless you in the multitude of ways I want to bless you and use you, both around you and in you and through you and all that kind of stuff, if you don't want to do what I've asked you to do. And so we all have to be cautious about that. And then last of all, obviously, they renewed their covenant together, you know, with David and him there. And part of that had to do with their lineage and so forth. So anyway, their friendship was renewed. So then he heads back to his homeland. David's still in the wilderness there. And then Saul gets a tip from the Ziphites. Remember, he's in the wilderness of Ziph. And so the Ziphites give Saul, hey, David's down here. And it's interesting. We're not going to read it all, but Saul says, okay, I heard he's pretty tricky, this David and his men. So Ziphites, could you go out there and sort of scout around, find out where he stays, where he goes, time of day, find out, just give me a record book of every place he goes, everything he does, give me that record, and so I'll come down and get him. And so they apparently do some investigating. And so he comes down there, King Saul, and so David flees to the wilderness of Maon, and so he's running again for his life, and the men with him. And so Saul goes down there as well, and so let's read what happened here. So Saul chases him down to the wilderness of Maon, verse 26 through 28, and just to give us a summary of what happened there. Someone like to read that for us? Okay, Steve?
And Saul went on this side of the mountain, and David and his men on that side of the mountain. David made haste to go away, for fear of Saul and his men compassed David and his men around to take them. But there came a messenger unto Saul, saying, Haste thee, and come, for the Philistines have invaded the land. Wherefore Saul returned from pursuing after David and went against the Philistines.
Good job. Okay. So yeah, there was. It looked like, oh man, the end is near. It's surrounding, and then all of a sudden he gets a messenger. Hey, the Philistines have invaded the land, and Saul says, "Oh, we got to go." And so they go. Timing is in. God again is watching out. So then it says after that, verse number 29, and David went up from thence and dwelt in the strongholds of Engedi, I guess it is. Sorry. So just that. So David there eventually gets there. He flees to this location. Just to give you an idea of some of the landscape in and around that area. So it's not a real luxurious place. So this is out toward the Dead Sea from there, and then looking from the Dead Sea back into that same location. I think the previous picture was probably up in this area. But there's also something there that's interesting. There were springs there, and so I'm sure that's why he went there. Just a picture of a couple of those. So it wasn't like it was a horrible place to be. And so, did you ever travel there?
Yes, we went up to the top in Getty in a SkyTrain.
Oh, okay.
And then if you wanted, you could walk back down through the rocks. And so Dr. Sinsky and I and Ed Horn and a few of us did just that. We walked that one.
Okay.
It took us about an hour to get back down.
Okay. Yes. Did you see the waterfalls?
Yes.
Yeah. So it looked like there was a refreshing in the middle of that very desert-like climate and situation. Would that be a right way to say it?
You don't see anything. You hardly see a tree. I mean, it's just rocks and boulders and canyons and wadis and so on.
Right. So back to, yeah, you can see, well, not that one. I was thinking of some of this area. And then that next, yeah, this slide here, just seeing that there's not a whole lot there to have shelter. But anyway, so David is there. So just thinking about God's work in David's heart, we've seen growing humility and dependence on God through all of this that God was trying to teach him. Okay, so we come to chapter 24 through 26. There's 3 incidents, and David holds back on violent vengeance. I don't know how else to put it. We could change that word a little bit. But in all of those, David waits on the Lord, trusting God to lead him and deal with his opposition. Sometimes God steps in there as well to help him with that. So let's go to chapter 24, and let's begin. Just read verses 4 through 7 to get us started. Someone like to read this for us here? So 24, 4 through 7. Okay, Gary, I'll Let me just stop you there. Let me just give a little introduction to this at the cave there. So after dealing with the Philistines, remember at the end of the previous chapter, Saul hears David being in Gedi. Sorry, I keep saying that wrong. So he heads there with 3,000 elite troops. So he grabbed his troops heading down there. So while there, King Saul enters a cave to relieve himself. He's going to the bathroom. It is this very cave that David and his men are hiding in the back sides of there. So it must have been a fairly good-sized cave to hide 600 men. So I don't know if it went in an opening and then opened up after that. But they heard some disturbance. And so that's where we pick it up, where David was there, and some of his men said, hey, this is the day, David. Your enemy, the guy that's pursuing you, the guy that's trying to kill you, the guy that doesn't want you to live anymore, he's right here. He's right here. So David sneaks in privately and cuts off his robe, apparently while he's going to the bathroom. Okay, so let's. So verse number 4. How did some of David's men? I just said they wanted to kill him. Okay, let's continue reading. Okay, so what did David do? I think most of us know. What did he do, and how did he feel about it?
He cut off the edge of his robe and he felt really bad about it.
Yeah, so he did. I mean, it was probably a very minuscule part of the edge of his robe. Apparently, it shows you how sharp his knife was. But cut it off quietly, and then he just, oh man, I shouldn't have done that. What was the reason why he didn't want? I don't know if I asked that question. I don't think I do. Why did David feel so bad? Why? I mean, let me ask you this. Just think about it just a moment. If you just took somebody's little part of their cloth, their clothing, just cut a little bit off, would you feel bad?
I think it was because he was the Lord's anointed.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, he was the Lord's anointed. He was David recognized his position under God's authority, and he just felt horrible. I defied an authority. I did not respect authority. I did not honor my authority. I did something sneakily, and that robe obviously was a kingly robe in some way, shape, or form. And so he saw that. Whoa. And so his men responded well, followed David, as it says there in verse 7. So what words or deeds in the next, I got a list of verses there. What words or deeds show David's honor towards Saul, not rebellion and hatred against Saul? So in verse 8, just read it quietly. What are some words there or actions in verse number 8 that testify that David still had great respect and showed honor, not rebellion against the king? Okay, so his position there, he stooped his face to the earth, bowed himself. So this was after he had left the cave. And so, as it says, after he'd left the cave, David went out of the cave and called to Saul and spoke these words. How did he refer to the king? Yeah, as Lord, my Lord. So an honorable position. Then if you jump down to verse number 10, what aspects there? So let me read verse 9. And David said to Saul, "Wherefore hearest thou men's words, saying, Behold, David seeketh thy hurt." And so in verse number 10, what do you see there that honor for a king? Anybody?
It says that I will not put forth mine hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed.
Yeah, again, that same recognizing who he is and his position. I think, again, people pushed him to kill him, and he even says that to King Saul. People wanted me to kill you, and I did not. I've spared you from that. And again, the Lord's anointed. How about in verse number 11? I think there's an interesting title that he gives to Saul there. How does it refer to him? Well, again, so he's saying, hey, I'm not where he says, I've not sinned against you. But there's something very earlier. How does he refer to King Saul in verse 11? Yeah, my father. And so I looked that up. It's a short form of Abba. It's 1,200 times in the Old Testament, and twice I forgot what of chief. And so it does have an aspect of authority, but it's primarily some kind of aspect of a relationship, obviously a family. And so David's still, hey, I'm part of your family. And he was. Remember, he had said, David didn't go home anymore. He sat at the king's table with Abner and Jonathan and himself. And so, so that he still recognizes as that, I've not done evil. I've not transgressed against you. I've not, as Brother Larry mentioned. How about in verse 12? Anything else? I guess, again, just the same thing. My hand shall not be upon thee. Verse 12, God will be my judge. God will take care of me. So ultimately, he comes down. So I thought it was interesting. Verse 14, how does David view himself if he's still talking to King Saul here? Yeah. What are you doing, King Saul? I am a nobody. I'm a nothing. I'm like a dead dog. You don't, if your dog dies, far away, you don't go searching for it. I'm like a flea. You don't even bother with a flea. So I just thought there was a sense of humility about all of that. And then verse 15 is again, and he says it a couple times here, but verse 15, the Lord therefore be judge and be judge between me and thee, and see and plead my cause and deliver me out of thy hand. He's just saying, I'm just going to trust God. So you're not, he doesn't say this exactly, but you're not thinking clearly. And I'm just going to trust my God. He will deal with you. He'll deal with me, but I'll trust him. Whatever he decides to do, I'm just going to rely upon him in these things. So King Saul admits to David, hey, you've treated me well, even though Saul had treated David poorly. I think there is this, maybe his eyes are finally opening a little bit, and he says, boy, David, you have spared my life. And I realize, wow, I've treated you like a criminal, and you're treating me like a king. What does King Saul, and he mentions it himself now, it was mentioned earlier by Jonathan, What does King Saul know about David in verse 20? Yeah, he's going to be king. He said, I know that. And so then he just asked David, verse 21, if David would make an oath of promise to King Saul that he'd not cut off Saul's lineage. And so he does. He doesn't have a problem with that. And then Saul leaves, and David goes to one of the strongholds in the wilderness. And so they depart. So just, it says the same thing. They're in that same place in Gedi there. And so he spares his life. So the second thing I just said, what David does, he keeps doing right or doing good while trusting God to deal with his enemies. Boy, is that hard. If you've ever had enemies, you feel like, I got to do something. And it doesn't mean you don't do things within a biblical framework, but you need to come to the place that I got to allow God to take care of this, without forcing my hand and doing something carnal or wicked. Okay, so we'll move forward with this, see how far we can get. Nabal in the fields of Moab. So Saul dies, it says, and the nation mourned him. David goes to the south and east. So the reason they got it this way, I take it, I did not study it, to be honest, but I think that was the normal route where Masada was. It's down, again, along the edge there, and then he went over the wilderness of Moab, or Maon, sorry. So that's where he heads. So here is some of the landscape in that area. You see, boy, it looks like traveling in a wonderful place. So that's closer to the Dead Sea. As you get in a little more inland, there are some bushes as he heads, what would it be, west. And then a portion of that area, this is some of the things I found in that area. So there is some grassy fields. That'll be important in what we're going to look at next. So a man named Nabal was a wealthy sheep herder, and it was shearing time, and they had 3,000 sheep, 1,000 goats. So we're talking lots and lots and lots. If you look at sheep shearing now, if you go to the internet and you look at sheep shearing, they have electrical razors, and they can get it done in a couple minutes. I'm sure it took much longer when you're hand doing it, however you did it in that day. So there was a time of merrymaking, excess. It was party time in a sense as they got their work done. So previously, David's men, and it's mentioned, I think, 3 times in the narrative here, or at least twice, that David's men had kept Nabal's shepherds safe. So this was, apparently he had been there for a little while, and Nabal's shepherds grazed in that field in those areas. So David's 600 men, they just, David said, hey, we do what's right, and if we can be a blessing, let's be a blessing. And so his men would watch out for the shepherds, watch out for the sheep, didn't never take anything, didn't steal anything, didn't hurt anybody. They were just there being a blessing. Okay, and so David thought, you know what? I'll go to Nabal and I'll ask for some provisions. We don't have a whole lot out here, and so let's go to Nabal and ask. Do notice, let me see, I wrote down one of the verse in part of what. So David sent some young men and said, who they were and what they were doing. Notice part of the response in verse number 10. And Nabal answered David's servants and said, who is David? And who is the son of Jesse? There be many servants now in the days to break away every man from his master. I would think that Nabal at least had heard of David. David has, slain his 10,000s and Saul his thousands. And so I would think, and I think it was just a cut. You just sound like every other rebellious servant who runs away from his master. And maybe he had, I'm sure he had a good number of servants, and he knew what it was like, and he said, So why, and then, so verse 11, he says, so why should I give you anything? Why should I, the food that's given to my servants and my shearers, and I'm paying for them to get done, why should I give it to you? And so it was really a poor thing. So David and 400 of his men, 200 of them kept by all their stuff, but 400 of his men girded on their swords and to get ready to destroy Nabal and his entire camp. And so a servant tells Nabal's wife of the events in 12 through 17. And I just want you to see how, so here David's making preparation. We're going to go there. We're going to take this man out. We're going to take out all that he owns and everybody is related to him. And we're going to get everything that we want, we need. And so we're just, and so he's just furious. And so this servant hears about that. Somehow maybe we're still intermingling with David's men and Nabal's servants and so forth. And So notice in verse, as this servant gets to Nabal's wife, Abigail, and verse number 17, notice what he says about his owner. Now therefore know and consider what thou wilt do. So he's saying, okay, I've told you all, hey, we're in big trouble. What are you going to do, Mrs. Nabal? For evil is determined against our master and against all his household, for he is such a son of Belial, and a man cannot speak to him. So he says, he's just a rotten guy. No one can talk to him. No one can tell him anything. No one can even converse with him. He's always got his own ideas. He won't listen to anybody. So I thought that was an interesting, because that comes up a number of times here, that this guy, even by those who loved him and cared for him, those who served him and followed him, those who were being taken care of by him, they knew this guy was not an example of godliness, okay? And by the way, remember, okay, just something to remember as you read your Bible, okay? When you see those things, and here is this unnamed person who gives a description about somebody, okay? That especially in the narrative portions, God is trying to say, okay, here, I want to give you some insights about what I see about this individual. And so as you read the scripture, it's just like they say, people write novels, that the author is omniscient. He knows everything. And so that's why sometimes in a well-written story, you have characters who may not be a part of the main line of the story, who all of a sudden comes in and gives a description of what's going on. And so the Holy Spirit is the greatest author there's ever been. And so he uses those kind of techniques at times in the scripture to say, hey, I just want to clarify to you. So yeah, maybe this guy had a rotten attitude, and sometimes you have to understand where it's coming from and realize, okay, well, that's probably not a good... But this is a repeated about Nabal. So how was David thinking as he went to meet Nabal? So 21 and 22. Now David had said, so whether he said it to himself, said it to his other commanders, said it to his leaders, or said it to all his men, surely in vain have I kept all that this fellow hath in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that pertaineth unto him, and he hath requited me evil for good. So, and more also do God unto the enemies of David. In other words, I'm going to do what I'll do to my enemies. If I leave of all that pertaineth to him by the morning light any men. I'll just leave it like that. So how was he thinking? And how does that contrast to what we've heard from his lips earlier? In a sense. Yeah, he changed. He got real angry. And what was his anger over? Yeah, he wasn't treated very well. Let me ask you, what happened earlier? Chapter 24. Was he treated well? Yeah, King Saul was. What was probably the primary difference in at least David's thinking between those two scenarios at this point? Even what we see, what he had been. I'm sorry.
One was his Lord.
Yes. Okay.
And the other one was just somebody he had helped.
Yes. Okay. So he, being the king's, the Lord's anointed made a difference in David's mind. But as we'll see, God wanted him to think a little bit differently. So what happened to Abigail after the servant told him? She gathers all the provisions, and went to meet David. And it was quite an entourage of things. It says 200 loaves of bread. 5 sheep ready to be dressed, 5 measures of parched corn, 100 clusters of raisins, 200 cakes of figs. And so we're just, there is a big load of food that she's taking with her. Who does she say is responsible? So she meets David as he's heading to take out Nabal. Who does she say is responsible for the situation? Just read 24 and 25 to yourself, and then 28 as well, because the same theme is repeated. Who does she say is responsible for all this present situation that David is upset about? Yeah, she said it's her fault. Was it her fault? No. Okay, but she, in love for for her family, and I say family, all the servants, all those people. She had a heart for them, and so she's trying to help them. What does she say about her husband? Verse 25. Yeah, it says the same thing, this man of Belial. And what else does she say about him? Yeah, folly is with him, which really means he's acting like a fool. The Hebrew term for fool is Nabal, or a very similar pronunciation, maybe a little bit different, but yeah. So, it's so again, I'd say the narrative tells us that Nabal was not the best of men. So, what did she and all Israel know about David in 28, and then really again in verse 30? So in verse 28 says, all Israel knows that the Lord is going to make you a sure house. Okay, his lineage will be for a long time. Verse number 30 says he's appointed the ruler over Israel. So apparently that kingship, not only did King Saul know about it, but it seems like it spread through the nation. Hey, David is the one who's going to be king. So that's well known. So how does she seek to help David even as she protects her household? And let me just read these. It's mentioned verse 20. Let me read 26 and then down 30 and 31. It says, "Now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord liveth and as thy soul liveth, seeing the Lord hath withholden thee from coming to shed blood and from avenging thyself with thine own hand, now let thine enemies and they that seek evil to my Lord be as Nabal," in other words, be a fool. And then verse number 30, "And it shall come to pass when the Lord shall have done to my Lord according to all the good that he hath spoken concerning thee, and shall appoint thee ruler over Israel, that this," speaking of this incident here that you are about to do, "this shall be no grief unto thee, nor offense of heart unto my Lord, either that thou hadst shed blood causeless, or that my Lord hath avenged himself, but whom the Lord shall have dealt well." But when the Lord hath dealt well with thee, with my Lord, then remember thine handmaid. So she says, I don't want you to do this, David. You're going to be king, and you don't want to look back at this and say, I shed blood that was not guilty. And I think this is really a key, I avenged myself. What a lesson. I took care of myself. And she has the insight to know that's not what God's servants ought to do. That's not a way a king should conduct his life and conduct himself. It's a powerful lesson for us. When something doesn't go your way, just be careful. It doesn't mean you do nothing. But be careful of your attitude, your motivation, about your attitude toward others, your motivation in dealing with this. Is it all about self? It is all about the way I want it done? Or is it about others, about the glory of God? Somehow, yes, there was a need there. And God was going to meet that, but it was interesting how she just said, David, you don't want to avenge yourself. Let God do it. So David praises her for her actions, provisions she gives, and the wisdom of her words. He does spare everyone at that time. And I just thought this is interesting. God often intervenes to hinder your foolishness or selfish choices. Never forget that when you're, I'll put it, and I'm going to make up some scenarios here, but when, if you're planning to do something and you're hemming and hawing because you're listening to God, but you're not listening to God, and so you're debating, and then someone just comes up and tells you a story. They don't know anything about what's going on in your mind or your heart, and they share something with you out of nowhere, and it deals right with what you're talking about. And it tells you, okay, here is the right choice. Here is the choice God would have you to make. And they're not counseling you. They don't know anything about it. But the Spirit of God says, God sovereignly put someone to come into your path to stop that. Just like, God does it here. God does it later when David falls for Bathsheba. There was a servant came to say, don't you know who this is? Don't you know this is the wife of one of your mighty men? God was trying to intervene. God does that over and over again in our lives. Whether it's something we're debating about and all of a sudden we hear it in church. And the pastor didn't know anything about your situation. Or maybe he did, but hopefully he wasn't thinking necessarily about preaching at you. But the fact is, God does that. And so all I'm saying is, here was a situation where this lady knew about it and she had enough gumption to say, hey, my household is doomed unless I act. I've got to do something. And so she does what she can with what she has and tries to intervene. And God was trying to help David because God wanted to bless David. God wanted to use David. And this would be a black spot. And of course, there was something later on, but this would have been an earlier black spot for a selfish choice. Any thoughts, comments, questions on that? Let me just finish this up real quick with Abigail. When Abigail told Nabal about these things, he was apparently drunk. It says in verse 37 that his heart became as stone. I think is how it's phrased. Yeah, his heart died within him and he became as a stone. I would think that he probably had a heart attack or a stroke and it just immobilized him in some way. And so, so when it says his heart became a stone, it wasn't working like it should. 10 days later, God took him. At the end of verse 38, it says, and the Lord smote Nabal that he died. And then later on, David recognized that God had kept him from evil and dealt. God not only kept him from doing evil, but also dealt with those who were doing evil against him. And so he praises God for. So again, wait on the Lord is part of that. After Nabal's death, Abigail agreed to be David's wife there. And so just the final lesson here, learning how God works to help you follow him is the concept there I was trying to get across. That God will often, when you really want to serve God, you really want to honor God, when you're making poor choices, God will seek to hinder you in some way, shape, or form. Whatever it happens to be. I'll just leave it at that. We need to pray. Any other questions, comments, thoughts with that? Okay, let's pray. Father, thank you for the testimony of David in this passage.